sun, the divine sun.
David de Keyser plays Pierre Auguste Renoir in The Divine Sun, a portrait of the French artist Renoir, compiled from contemporary sources and presented by John House.
There's an immediate paradox about Renoir. His paintings show a sunlit, smiling world, peaceful, luminous landscapes, and young, untroubled people in easy social relationships. Yet everything we know about Renoir the man tells us how unhappy he was with his own time, how ill at ease with its fashionable bourgeois society, and how hostile to the results of the Industrial Revolution. He won his fame as a painter of modern life, but it was a very partial and selective vision of this life. Why was this so? The story of his life and career as an artist give us some clues, I think. Pierre Auguste Renoir was born in 1841 in Limoges in central France, but when he was a boy his family moved to Paris. They went to live in a house in one of the crowded old streets at the centre of the city near the Louvre Museum. His father was a tailor, a skilled working-class trade, and Renoir took up a similar manual occupation.
I was apprenticed to a manufacturer of glazed china, and by the age of 13 I was earning my own living. I had to paint little bouquets of flowers on a white background and was paid 5 sous a dozen for doing so. If there were large pieces to decorate, the bouquets were larger. Then I was promoted from bouquets to figures, but always at starvation wages. I remember that the profile of Marie Antoinette brought me 8 sous. After 4 years, my apprenticeship was complete, and at 17, I saw the magnificent career of porcelain painter opening up in front of me, when a catastrophe occurred, and it ruined my dreams of the future. It was at this time that the first experiments in printing on porcelain were being made, and of course, the public wanted nothing else. So all the old shops had to close.
Renoir was never to forget this lesson. Throughout his life, he fervently supported the traditions of craftsmanship, and he was passionately opposed to the machine. The worker in industry was forced to put up with intolerable conditions, he felt, and the machine denied him the satisfaction of manufacturing an object from start to finish with his own hands. For a while, Renoir was able to go on making a living as a decorative painter, painting fans and then window blinds for export to the colonies. But in 1860, when he was 19, he took a bold step. He decided to become a serious painter, and he used the money he'd saved from his decorative painting to enter the studio of one of the leading academic teachers of the day, the Swiss-born Charles Gleyre. But the solemnity of academic teaching never appealed to him, and once, when Gleyre asked him whether he'd taken up painting just for his own amusement, Renoir replied,
"Of course, and I promise you that I wouldn't do it if it didn't amuse me."
But most important for him at Gleyre's studio was the chance to meet a group of like-minded young artists, among them Claude Monet, who along with Renoir was to become one of the leaders of the Impressionist painters. These artists believed that a painter working in the Paris of the 1860s should not paint subjects from the past, from mythology and history, subjects like the birth of Venus or the death of Caesar. Instead, they ought to be painting scenes of their own day. And so it was that in 1868 he exhibited a life-sized picture of a young girl in a long summer dress, standing in a woodland glade holding a parasol. And the critic Théophile Torre, a leading supporter of modern life painting, hailed Renoir's success.
The dress of white gauze is in brilliant sunlight, but the white has a slight greenish cast where the foliage of the trees is reflected on the material. Then the girl's head and neck are in a delicate half-shadow under the shade of her white parasol. The whole effect is so natural and so true to life that one might find it false, because we're so accustomed to seeing nature represented in the conventional colors of bad painting. But after all, doesn't color depend on the atmosphere that surrounds it?
This was to become one of the Impressionists' basic aims, not to paint figures in isolation and then to fill in some artificial background, but to show the colored sunlight and the shadows playing across them, to paint them as part of their real surroundings. The painting that Torre described was exhibited at the Salon, the huge official annual art exhibition in Paris. But the jury who selected the paintings to be shown at these salons soon took against these modern paintings. So, to find a public for their art, and also, of course, to find buyers, Renoir and his friends had to organize their own exhibitions. It was at the first of these, in 1874, that the group was christened the Impressionists. And here Renoir could exhibit his most ambitious paintings of contemporary life in Paris. The ball at the Moulin de la Galette caught the enthusiastic eye of his young friend Georges Rivière.
In a sun-bathed garden, shaded only by a few scraggy acacia trees, you can see a happy crowd of the most charming girls and lively young men. Their chatter quite drowns the sound of the orchestra. Noise, laughter, movement, sunlight, all in an atmosphere of youthfulness. It's an essentially Parisian work. These girls are the ones we rub shoulders with every day. A smile and a pair of pretty cuffs, that's all that's needed to make them happy. Monsieur Renoir's proved it. No one before him has recorded the events of everyday life on such a large canvas. This is a real history painting. Monsieur Renoir and his friends have realized that history painting isn't just a comic illustration of stories from the past. Those who want to paint history must paint the history of their own times.
A couple of years later, Renoir's brother Edmond, a journalist, described how Renoir had become the painter of the essence of modern Paris, the real life of its streets and its places of entertainment.
It's by living in the open air that he has become the painter of the open air. In fact, he's never been enclosed by the four cold walls of a studio. Their monotonous grey or brown tones haven't dulled his eye. Ordinary things surround him. Everything he sees has a great influence on his work. Take his painting of the Moulin de la Galette, for example. What he does is to install himself there for 6 months, where he quickly makes contact with a whole little world, a world with its own style. Professional models would never be able to copy the poses he sees there, and he manages to catch the movement of his popular merrymaking with a most extraordinary verve. I'll sketch a quick portrait of him for you. He's pensive and solemn, his eye always looking around him. He crosses the boulevard 20 times as he walks down it. And he's so absent-minded and disorganized that he'll return for the same thing 10 times without remembering what it was he wanted. He's always on the move in the street, but when he's indoors, he's quite still, totally absorbed in a painting he's doing.
During these years, Renoir painted many scenes of modern Parisian life, festive, smiling scenes of girls in theatre boxes and lovers lunching in outdoor cafes or enjoying the air of a boating party. But he was also receiving many commissions for portraits, and these were not always a pleasure, as Renoir recalled when Madame de Bonnière, the wife of a fashionable novelist, sat for him.
Lord bless us, I don't think I've ever been so bored with a painting. You know how I feel about painting a skin, which won't take the light well. Well, it was fashionable at the time for women to be pale. Madame de Bonnière was as pale as wax, and I kept saying to myself, if only she could get a good steak inside her, just once. But it was no go. I worked in the mornings till lunchtime, so I had a chance of seeing what they brought my model to eat. A miserable little scrap in the bottom of a plate. Well, you can see how much good that was for putting some colour in her skin. And her hands. She put them in water before the sitting to accentuate their whiteness. Just imagine, I'd come across one of the most charming women it's possible to meet, and she doesn't want to have any colour in her cheeks.
No wonder Renoir felt like throwing his tubes, brushes, paint-box, canvas, the lot, out of the window. And yet the world he depicted in his paintings was always serene and happy, a sort of earthly paradise in a modern setting. But his own eccentric personal manner sometimes quite disconcerted his fashionable patrons. Madame Blanche was one of these, the wife of a famous physician who'd commissioned some decorations from Renoir. She was moved to protest in this letter to her husband.
He's quite mad, in his painting as well as in his conversation. He's wholly uneducated, of course, very well-meaning, but he scorns everything that's clean and tidy. At the dinner table, his nervous tics and his conversation are really unpleasant. You mustn't forget that we have no manservant, and Dinah isn't at all pleased at having to wash men's trousers and boots, which are encrusted with mud, because Monsieur Renoir is not one to be deterred by mud, and we don't want to dirty our nice rooms, which have just been newly decorated.
But Madame Blanche's son was a young painter who much admired Renoir's art, and he made no such complaints in his letter to his father.
Renoir came to see us yesterday, and we spent far longer than usual at dinner. Mother was so impatient. She said she just couldn't dine with him. She finds him dull and dirty, and slow at eating with intolerable nervous twitches. He talks just like a Parisian workman, and rubs his nose all the time with his first finger. But I've enjoyed myself a lot. Renoir sketched a superb sunset effect in just 10 minutes, which infuriated Mother, who told him that he was simply wasting paint.
The reason for his curious behaviour seems to me to be this. When Renoir was moving in fashionable circles, he always wanted to stress that he was an outsider, from a different class and a different background. Instead of taking on the style of his bourgeois patrons, he always presented himself as an artisan and a craftsman, and he emphasised his untutored origins. But around this time, in 1880, questions about the painter's craft were also beginning to worry him. His open-air subjects were selling, and he was gaining a real reputation as a portraitist, and yet he felt that his knowledge of the business of painting was quite inadequate. Jacques-Émile Blanche had watched him at it.
He worked in an extraordinary fashion, with multicolour hatchings and criss-cross strokes, the crimsons overlapping the blues and greens. Gooseberry jam, they called it. But time has already blended these startling colours into a single rich and harmonious surface. Renoir apparently knew they would eventually settle down peaceably with their neighbours.
By painting like this, he could readily capture fleeting effects of light, light on hot summer's days and light on rainy days bouncing back off black umbrellas. He was master of the quick sketch of nature. But there should, he felt, be more than this to painting. He wanted to be able to express the substance and the form of objects, to give a real sense of the physical presence of the world around him.
I'd come to the end of Impressionism and was reaching the conclusion that I couldn't paint or draw at all. When you're painting out of doors, the light changes continually, and you don't have time to take trouble over composing the picture. I discovered that the lessons I'd learnt going round museums were really the only thing that mattered. It may seem stupid to give up a style which the public has got used to, but I began doing some paintings, drawing in all the details with a pen before I began to paint. I was trying to be so precise and accurate, and all because of my hatred of Impressionism.
So Renoir began to travel, in search of solutions to his problems. He went to Algeria, the traditional haven for French artists seeking the brilliant light and colour of North Africa.
One day, while I was painting a landscape in Algiers, I saw a man approaching who seemed to be dressed in purple and cloth of gold. He came down the path with great dignity, leaning on a stick. He looked like some magnificent prince out of the 1001 Nights. When the traveller reached me, my illusion vanished. My emir was nothing but a shabby beggar. The sun, the divine sun, had enriched him with its light and transformed his sordid rags into a royal robe. It's always the same in Algeria. The magic of the sun transmutes the palm trees into gold, the water seems full of diamonds, and men become the kings from the east.
Renoir made this first expedition to the southern sunlight in 1881, but this didn't at once solve his problems. And later in the same year he went south again, but this time to Italy, to study the art of the past in the museums. He was particularly impressed by Raphael's wall paintings in Rome, and in Naples by the paintings from the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. In his previous pictures, he'd concentrated on the play of light and shade, but after seeing Raphael's paintings, he felt that he could suggest the real effect of sunlight, not by scattering patches of light and shade across his figures, but by making them simpler and more monumental. Instead of girls wearing the latest fashionable dresses, he began to concentrate on painting the female nude, and after several years' work, he produced a picture of bathers, which quite startled his friends. The figures were very crisply outlined, their firm round flesh carefully modelled, and the naked girls stood out very clearly from their background instead of being absorbed into it. Bat Morisot, who'd exhibited with Renoir in the Impressionist shows, discovered the unusually careful way that he began to prepare for these paintings when she visited his studio.
On a stand there was a drawing in red pencil and chalk of a young mother nursing her child, so subtle and so graceful. It was quite charming. He showed me a whole series done from the same model. He really is a draftsman of the first order, And it would be interesting to show all these preparatory studies to the public, which generally imagines that the Impressionists dash things off in a very casual way. I don't think it's possible to go further in the rendering of form. There are 2 drawings of women going into the water to bathe, which I find particularly delightful. Renoir told me that he now sees the nude as one of the essential forms of art.
Though Bat Morisot didn't realize it at the time, Renoir's models for this young nursing mother and her child were his mistress, Aline Cherigot, and their baby son, Pierre. Aline was a solid country girl, and Renoir seemed to relish her peasant origins, and he presented her as a sort of earth mother. She'd accompanied him to Italy in 1881, and Pierre was born in 1885. But only Renoir's closest friends knew of their relationship. And it was only after their marriage in 1890 that he introduced Aline to his more fashionable bourgeois friends, such as Bat Morisot.
I shall never be able to describe my astonishment at meeting this ungainly woman who, I don't know why, I'd imagined to be just like her husband's paintings.
Renoir's pictures by this date were becoming generalized and idealized images of youth and beauty. His young models, sometimes nude and sometimes in pretty summer dresses and hats, were placed in rural settings, in flowery fields or under leafy trees, and the whole scenes are bathed in a glowing coloured sunlight. At this point, it seems, he could no longer visualize his earthly paradise in the setting of Paris and its suburbs. He abandoned the crowded, troubled metropolis and sought instead more timeless and unchanging locations, deep in rural France and later in the south on the Mediterranean coast. He was still studying the art of the past, and particularly now that of the French 18th century, which showed a smiling and untroubled world, just like the one he wanted to paint. And he came to view the whole of the 18th century, and not just its art, as an ideal. He believed it had been an ordered society where everyone knew their proper place and where the skill of ordinary workers was still valued, and he set this idyllic vision against his view of modern society, dominated by the vulgar ambitions of the bourgeoisie, where mechanization had deprived the industrial worker of his individuality. Renoir remained on close terms with Bat Morisot, and after her death and the death of her husband, he became a sort of guardian to her daughter, Julie. Julie, then a teenager, recorded her impressions of him in her diary in 1899.
Monsieur Renoir is concerned about so many things and thinks of everyone. He teaches one to consider everything and to cultivate one's own feelings. When he talks, he draws such a picture of the wretched workers in the forges that it would break your heart. Just to think that so many people suffer so much, and that one doesn't always think enough about the deprived people on this earth, which is otherwise so full of joy. Perhaps, as Monsieur Renoir says, we ought to go without many of the things which our love of luxury makes us think are indispensable, and which at the same time create these appalling jobs.
No doubt Renoir was also thinking of the time when the machine had put paid to his own first career as a painter on porcelain. His friend Thaddée Natanson observed him closely during these years of self-searching and reflection.
Renoir is always in a state of agitation, striding around, bending and straightening his back, flexing his fingers, and gesticulating with his arms. His face is dry and deeply furrowed, always animated with nervous tics, but his eyes shine out, brilliant and gentle, and as he strides up and down, sits, stands up again, forgets his cigarette, lights a new one, his conversation goes on, touching on all sorts of subjects, on his dislike of 100 aspects of his own age and his regrets for the past, on his enthusiasm for Delacroix and his love of Watteau. To hear him talk, you would think he didn't know how to paint or draw, that he didn't like to paint real pictures and only gets pleasure from toying with his colours and making quick sketches. And this in spite of all the painting he's done. Yet there's nothing false about his modesty. He makes a joke, he tells an amusing story, he mocks at something and expresses his indignation. And then he returns to the subject of the 18th century masters, whose art he only claims to be carrying on from afar.
And right up to his death, Renoir continued to measure his art against the art of the past. He still loved the smiling mood of the French 18th century, but he also looked further back in the history of painting, to Titian and Rubens, the two great painters who more than any others had created a sumptuous vision of the world by free-flowing brushwork and by lavish colour. It was to this tradition that Renoir wanted to belong, But at the same time, he saw himself at base as just a craftsman who knew his trade.
I arrange my subject as I want it. Then I go ahead and paint it, just like a child. I want a red to be sonorous, to sound like a bell. If it doesn't turn out like that, I put on more reds, or other colours, till I get it. I'm no cleverer than that. I have no rules, no methods. Anyone can look over my materials or watch how I paint. He'll soon see that I have no secrets. When I look at a nude, for example, there are myriads of tiny tints in the skin, and I must find the ones which will make the flesh on my canvas live and quiver. I so much like a thing that Cézanne said once. He said, "It took me 40 years to find out that painting is not the same thing as sculpture." Which means that at first he thought he had to load his canvases with paint to match, if he could, the effects of sculpture. But later he realized that the painter must use color to get the same result, the same fullness, even when the oil is laid on very thinly. Look at the pictures by Rubens in Munich. There is the most glorious fullness and the most beautiful color, and the layer of paint is very thin. Titian's a man who always stays great for me. His painting is a mystery. You can't tell how he worked. No one ever painted flesh as he did. It seems to have light coming out of it, to glow like a lantern. It seems to rise above painting.
By 1900, Renoir too wanted his painting somehow to rise above the physical and the material world, to create a whole world of beauty and happiness. In the 1870s, he and the other Impressionists had tried to record as immediately as possible the play of colour and sunlight across the objects they saw around them. But now, in his 60s, Renoir wanted his paintings to do more than this.
When one's trying to copy nature, the most difficult thing is to know exactly where to stop. A painting mustn't stink of the model, and yet one must feel the presence of nature. I like a painting that makes me want to stroll in it, if it's a landscape, or if it's a female figure, makes me want to run my hand across a breast or a back. Don't ask me if painting should be objective or subjective. A painting should be something likable, joyous and pretty. Yes, pretty. There are too many unpleasant things in life for us to want to make yet more of them. But I realize only too well that it's difficult to admit that painting can be really great painting if it's jolly. And people who laugh aren't taken seriously.
And Renoir never lost his sense of humour, even when, in his last years, he was racked with arthritis. The nervous movements which Nat Anson had described in the 1890s were only the prelude to a succession of attacks which left him virtually crippled and finally unable even to stand upright. He now lived mainly in the south of France, on the Mediterranean coast near Nice, in an area which had strong links with Italy and with the ancient classical past. And in this sun-bathed landscape, with its old olive groves and hill towns, he created a vision in his art which wholly transcended his physical state. He even began to work on large-scale sculptures with the help of a young assistant, and in this way he produced a full-length figure of Venus, larger than life-size, a simple, monumental figure of the goddess as an image of ideal beauty. Renoir's son Pierre often used to visit this studio and look on.
Father would make a sketch on paper or canvas to give a general idea of how the mass of clay was to be shaped. Then, waving his cane, the old man would indicate how the work was to proceed. At one place, he'd make a mark on the maquette to show where the young sculptor was to cut some of the clay away. And at another, he'd make a pass through the air with his stick to show how the contour was to swell out by adding more clay. Then the figure would be turned on its pedestal and looked at from another angle, and it would probably need trimming down again. And so they communicated by grunts and waves of the stick. And when the thing got close to what was wanted, Father would say,
That's it.
and all the time the assistant would be making his little jabs with the tool, so much like my father's brushstrokes that you'd think the work was his own.
Renoir's last years were very difficult. His wife died during the First World War, and his two older sons were severely wounded in the fighting. But despite his own disabilities, he was still able to paint right up to the end. And when the French picture dealer René Gimpel visited him in 1918, just 18 months before he died, he found no signs of self-pity.
He was a pathetic sight. His knees were bent double, and he couldn't unbend them. His arms hung down with his elbows against his side and his forearms raised. All his bones stuck out in sharp points, the skin thinly stretched across them. His hands were a gruesome sight, emaciated like the legs and claws of a plucked and trussed chicken. His face was pale and thin, and his eyes... I searched them for a sign of life in him. Could this shapeless thing reply to me? I hazarded a remark. My wife and I are great admirers of your work and have come to pay homage to you. Renoir motioned for his attendant to light him a cigarette, and then he spoke. I still have all the vices, he said, even that of painting. He smiled, and his eyes, just now so dull, came brilliantly to life.
Renoir's last paintings are the most sumptuous of his whole career. Visions of figures in landscape or in rich interiors. The figures and their surroundings together are treated as a single living whole, so that every corner of the pictures is packed with activity. Their brushwork is lavish and vigorous, and their colour kaleidoscopic, dominated by vibrant reds and oranges which suggest the southern sunlight, and make it seem as if the figures themselves are glowing with warmth and health. As his own physical horizons narrowed and death was only a short while away, he concentrated his last energies on his painting. His imagination could take wing and create a pictorial world of the greatest splendour.
What admirable beings the Greeks were. They lived such happy lives. They imagined their gods came down to earth to find their paradise here and to make love. Yes, earth was the paradise of the gods. The paradise of the gods. That's what I want to paint.
David de Keyser played Renoir in a portrait of the artist compiled and presented by John House of the Courtauld Institute of Art. Other parts were played by Carol Boyd, David Bradshaw, Arnold Diamond, David Graham, Nigel Graham, William Hope, Nerissa Knights, Crawford Logan, Mark Straker, and Melinda Walker. The Divine Son was produced by Judith Bumpus.